Welcome to What's Brewing with IAT Insurance Group, where episode after episode we cover the latest marketplace trends with subject matter experts who are fueling our mission to provide insurance answers together. Grab your cup and let's settle in.
Hi, I'm Nicole Kirby, and welcome back to What's Brewing. I'm the AVP of Marketing and Analytics for Commercial Transportation here at IAT. I'm excited to welcome two colleagues to today's conversation, Jaden Toretta and Brian Gorkowski. Jaden is a familiar voice to our listeners and serves as an associate loss control representative at IAT. Joining the show for the first time is Brian Gorkowski, Senior Manager in IAT's Special Investigations Unit, otherwise known as SIU, which I have to say, Brian, really excited that you're part of this today because when we talk to new agencies, onboarding them and things, we talk about our claims capabilities, and we always talk about the SIU unit, the Special Investigations. So I'm excited that you're here today to join us for the conversation. Today, we're continuing our discussion on strategic cargo theft, but with a specific focus on what happens after the theft. Once the cargo is stolen, where does it actually go? And how does it re-enter the market? So thanks for joining me today, guys.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive in, let's level set for anyone who may be new to this topic. Jaden, can you give us a quick overview of what we mean when we say strategic cargo theft and why it's such a growing concern in the transportation industry?
Absolutely. Strategic cargo theft is something that we've seen expand rapidly in the past maybe 5 years. And what we're seeing here is now a very different style of theft compared to what we're used to in what we would call straight theft. So this strategic cargo theft is a change in the way that thieves are operating and also a change in where these stolen goods are going. So a lot is changing from the physical security of a driver being protective of their load to how a carrier or broker is now responsible for ensuring that their freight is not going into the wrong hands and suddenly disappearing. One thing to note is that there's a rapidly growing market as strategic cargo theft grows and shifts from straight theft. There's now opportunities for this stolen freight to travel the globe.
And I guess adding to that, Jaden, about strategic thefts, there's all these different methods now, like fictitious pickups, hacker-enabled rerouting, double brokering, basically anything that's helping thieves reroute cargo from one location to another location. They offer stolen shipments to be rerouted directly from one warehouse to another to a collection spot. Sometimes warehouses get goods and they don't even know why they're getting the goods. They set them aside and somebody else comes there and says, "Oh, I was directed here to pick this up." So that's kind of like an example of what all I just said, the rerouting, the hacking, the fictitious pickup, all inclusive into what happens at the end of that and how the cargo then disappears.
So once a load is stolen, it's not just disappearing, it's moving through a very deliberate system. So let's talk about destinations. Brian, once cargo is stolen, where do these goods typically end up?
So like for food and consumables, prescription products, they usually stay local, sometimes regional. I have an example of beer being stolen, one of our loads, and there was kegs of beer, and literally it only made it down the road in a warehouse. And we know this because later on law enforcement had taken some enforcement action and were able to recover these kegs of beer, somehow trace it back to our load, and they only went a couple miles down the road. They didn't go very far. Sometimes it's cross borders, international market. It depends on the goods. Everything is opportunistic and everything is demand driven. And I know we'll get into that down the road here, but high value materials like copper, lumber, automobiles, they move anywhere they want. And a lot of times it will be international. A lot of times it will be multiple states or all the way across the country. Entire truckload of scrap was recently stolen, scrap copper. And I know we are in the process of trying to track that down through, scrap yards in Illinois. So these things go from one state to another, sometimes just down the road, but at the end of the day, the goods are ending up wherever the demand is at.
Do you see, I mean, especially now that you mentioned the copper, I mean, is there any enforcement with some of these people who are actually taking in these goods? Because I thought I remember like a while back, they were talking about people who were actually intaking the goods. Is there any sort of like repercussions for them? Because clearly sometimes they have to know that it's stolen.
Well, I think the main repercussion would be accepting stolen property. The problem with that is proving it's stolen. So in the example of the scrap copper, there's no serial numbers, there's no identifying marks on it. It is just scrap copper pieces.
Yeah.
Even when you're stealing a full load of copper pipe that is, destined for plumbing, how do you track that? So you're right. If someone's buying a full truckload full of copper pipe, they should know it's stolen if they're buying it for less than what they would normally pay for it. But not really is there any kind of tracking, especially when it comes to metal thefts. And metal thefts are on the rise, especially copper right now.
Yeah.
I'll just add to what Brian said there. I think it's important to understand that criminals also have a knowledge of and willingness to spend money in a form of return on investment. The thieves will be willing to absorb some of the costs that go with getting that stolen freight back into legitimate supply chains through practices such as relabeling and repackaging. So eventually, when it shows up to maybe a mom and pop shop or a flea market, that final destination might not know that the good was ever stolen, or maybe they just don't care that it was stolen. They think that they got a great price on some new inventory.
So what's striking is that it's not so random. It's very calculated based on the value, demand, and risk. And some of this threat sounds familiar, but some of it sounds very modern. What stayed the same and what's changed over time?
I think from our end of trying to track stuff down and the special investigations unit side of the house, what's on change is the goods still have to go somewhere. And like I said, it's very opportunistic. Someone steals a load of seafood. What happens to that seafood? It's perishable. It has to be offloaded quickly. It has to be used quickly. So if somebody were come to you and you had a seafood restaurant and say, "Hey, I'll sell you these lobsters for $10 a piece," and normally you're going to spend $50 a piece on them or whatever that number may be, you're like, "Hey, this is a great deal." And to Jaden's point, sometimes when you're in business, you turn that blind eye, or maybe you turn your thinking cap off to a great deal, and you just unwillingly kind of get into it, hoping everything's on the up and up. So I don't think that's changed at all. I know I've said the words already, but it's opportunistic and it's demand. That's what drives goods to be stolen.
Right. And the interesting thing is, I was actually talking to my son that we were doing this podcast today about where stolen goods go. And he was kind of asking me that question. I was like, well, where do you think they go? And he's like, well, I, don't know. And I'm like, well, like, what if you're on Facebook Marketplace looking for something? And quite honestly, he said, honestly, I'm looking for a good deal. So it does kind of tie back to that of, you may not even know. I mean, especially where some of this stuff ends up. So it's, innocent. You're just looking for a good deal, not knowing that it's an actual stolen good.
Yeah, and I'd just add to Brian's point and to what Nicole's saying about not knowing that these goods were ever stolen. As information travels more quickly, that ownership chain can become blurred very quickly. The theft indicators start to disappear, and as law enforcement is less likely to actually make any sort of recovery, it's even more difficult for that end user to identify the possibility or the warning signs of a stolen good.
Exactly.
And I guess adding one more thing to that, Jaden and Nicole, when the goods change hands, the first person may not seem very legit. You may be able to tell, like, oh, this person seems kind of shady, or this business transaction seems too good to be true. But time it gets down the line, you may be going to what you think is a legitimate source, a legitimate store, a legitimate platform of some sort, and you're purchasing that, and it's been washed, if you will. kind of like, we talk about with money and that kind of stuff. You don't know where it's come from, where it's gone, and now you think it's just a good deal. I can get this for $30 cheaper here, so I'm going to go to this source and buy it for X amount of dollars cheaper.
So it really underscores that this problem is not just about theft. It's about demand, which Brian, you've mentioned several times. So let's talk about recovery. Once IET is notified of a potential cargo theft loss, how does SIU get involved? And do you work with, outside law enforcement, or kind of what are the next steps like once you're notified of one of these claims happens?
Yeah, once SIU becomes involved in a cargo theft, we will contact law enforcement. We'll make sure that the policyholder has made a report with them. We'll find out if there are any cameras. We may send vendors looking for investigative leads to assist law enforcement, but we certainly talk to them. We ask them, law enforcement, if they've communicated with entities like CargoNet, which actually put out bulletins countrywide once cargo is stolen.
Oh.
So people are on notice that cargo has been stolen, and we attempt to recover it. Sometimes, though, the reality check of recovering it is a little too much because it's gone. Sometimes we don't get notified for a day or two. Sometimes we don't get notified for longer than that. And as discussed earlier, some of this cargo is perishable and it goes fast, or the networks are so vast, it's moving across the country internationally before maybe IAT or law enforcement can really get a foothold and really investigate this to figure out where the cargo actually went to.
So as part of this, prevention is always the goal, right, Jaden?
Exactly.
We don't want it to get to Brian's area necessarily, but unfortunately we know it happens. So what practical steps can motor carriers take to reduce this risk?
I mean, I always try to start with an understanding that it takes security in multiple approaches. We never want to start training our dispatch, but stop locking our trailers. We're always going to follow our physical security approaches with locks, GPS, and physical barriers, adding redundancies so that one security measure is missing and opening a door for a thief. But one of the things that carriers should really start to look for as they start to train their staff in potential red flags is things such as urgency, right?
Well, it's always one of those things where it's like, it's never going to happen to me. Always that sense of urgency. You're like, oh, well, I'd figure that out. But isn't it the fact that, these people are multitasking so much and it's like so critical when a load does come up that they do want to grab it? So do you think it's that, sense of urgency? It's like, really kind of think twice about it?
I think that a lot of times the industry does move quickly. So they are very tempted to, get that next load for their driver and make sure that they're taking great care of their brokers and their relationships and moving quickly in order to meet the demands and meet the requests of their shippers. So urgency can feel kind of natural sometimes. And it's important to recognize that we need to take a second look at some of the warning signs, where the email comes from, the name of the email, anything that looks a little bit different within that. These are all things that maybe larger companies focus on through security training, cybersecurity training about phishing, that some smaller companies may not have either the time or the know-how of how to provide that training. So it's important for these individuals at the companies to recognize that if something might look a little bit off here, it's worth investigating rather than moving forward to complete that request quickly.
And just to add here, many times we're dealing with not just one individual. We're dealing with an organization who is behind these thefts. We're dealing with an organized criminal movement, if you will, that teaches each other how to counter, oh, I don't have time for that right now, or here's the urgency, or put all the things in place that makes someone make a bad decision. And that's all that is a bad decision at the time, and that costs the load right then and there. But the criminal organizations that are behind this know how to be manipulative.
It's just like, we have lost control go out and give tips and suggestions on how to navigate through this, whereas they have a similar thing that they're training people doing the same thing on their side. So it is quite fascinating.
I think I would also add that carriers should recognize what the current trends are and what the hot items are. Look, like Brian said, look to those bulletins and see, we're not seeing so much of just hotspots in Los Angeles and Chicago. It's going to be in Montana where that freight is leaving the warehouse. So understand not where you're going potentially, but what you're hauling and what's been hot recently.
That's really good advice.
Yeah, to add to that, Nicole, if you're in the trucking business and you're looking to take a load, know what is not the hot spots, but what is the hot material, like metal thefts right now, or lumber, or like during COVID. I think toilet paper was the number one stolen thing for a while. Know what is in demand, that you may be hauling, that you will be a target even if you don't realize it. And it could be as simple as watching the news to find out what's in demand.
So IAT Loss Control Specialist Jared Fritz has shared great insights on these topics in our previous episodes of What's Brewing, and we encourage our listeners to go back to check those for a deeper dive for more information. And so I just want to thank both of you for spending some time with us today. And thank you for listening to What's Brewing, and we'll see you next time.
Providing insurance answers together is what we do best. Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of What's Brewing. Until next time.